And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. It's great to have a Texan field with us today with Brian Harrison, who's been in the Texas House of Representatives for the last 4 years. Brian, it's great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, great to be with you here, Peter. Looking forward to discussion.
Absolutely, and we'll get. I've been intrigued watching you kind of call out some of the, let's say, shenanigans, for want of a better word, that have been happening in Texas. And as we were talking before, probably been to Texas more, Texas and Virginia, probably the two more than anywhere else, and it's been an eye opener seeing some things in Texas. Maybe I wish I didn't see. Ignorance is bliss, but
Me too. Me too.
but you've been there. Um, I'd like to get a little bit of your background.
Yeah.
You've only been there in the house for 4 years,
Yeah.
since 2021. You've been certainly very outspoken in terms of many issues, and we'll get into some of that. You were chief of staff at the Department of Health and Human Services. Many have worked in the family business, but maybe give us a little bit of your background before
Yeah.
we get into why on earth you wanted to put yourself into the mix of running for a level of government in the House of Representatives.
I may or may not ask myself that every day. No, I'm just kidding. It's an incredible honor to get to be the voice for freedom and the fighter for liberty for my friends and neighbors here in House District 10. And for folks who are familiar with Texas, my district is just a little bit south of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. It's a district that has historically been rural, but is a very high growth area. A lot of folks moving to Ellis County, Texas, which is where my district is located. So yeah, no, the shortest I can make, I'll make my background. I grew up here in Ellis County, Texas. Went to junior high and high school here. I studied economics at Texas A&M University, and then jumped into public service right away. I was in the White House for the last two Republican presidents. I've worked in small family businesses here in Texas, and then most recently, as you mentioned before, I got elected to the Texas House of Representatives. I served as President Trump's chief of staff at the biggest federal agency in the world, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where I oversaw a staff of about 85,000 people and a budget of about 1.5 trillion dollars, 26 operating and staff divisions, and really got to I was very honored to get to have a role helping President Trump deliver some of the biggest conservative victories from his first administration. And after Joe Biden took over, I immediately went home and was asked by the conservative activists here in the district if I would consider running for the Texas legislature. And they told me there were all kinds of problems in the Texas government. I had heard of these problems, but I didn't have any idea the scope of the way in which the Texas government, which has a reputation for leading in conservative values and low taxes and low regulations, um, nothing could have prepared me for the shock of learning after I got elected how not only is that not true. The Texas government is a high tax state. It's a high regulation state, but the fact that also that our conservative values are being undermined by the very Republican officials that voters have given massive majorities in the Texas House, the Texas Senate, the governor's mansion, lieutenant governor's office. Many of our Republican principles are being betrayed, not defeated by Democrats, but being betrayed by people who run for office and call themselves Republicans. And I'm sure the topic we're going to get to here today is no exception to that. So that's a little bit of my background here. And as you mentioned, I got elected in 2021 and was just reelected last month.
So what kind of were what are your reasons? Everyone, I guess, has a reason where they get into politics,
Yeah.
whether it's a local issue or a national issue or working with the local party, or what kind of moved you to that direction?
Yeah. So I've been accused of being, sort of what people call a true believer. I am really passionate about the principles that made, in my humble opinion, America. That maybe there's some offense to this across the pond, but I don't think so. Our nations have a great relationship these days. But I think America is the greatest nation that God has ever blessed this planet with, and I'm a proud Texan. So I naturally also think that Texas is the greatest state in the greatest country that's ever existed, and it really hurts. It hurts my heart, but it also makes me quite furious to see how too many people in public office today use public service, not as a means to help their fellow man or to do what I believe is the number one role of government, which is to protect our freedoms and our liberties, which do not come from government, but come from our creator. And I see far too many people in the federal government here in Texas, as well as the state government here in Texas. I should say federal government in America, state government here in Texas, betraying those principles and selling out the next generation for present comfort for themselves. They view government more as a way to punish their enemies and help their friends, as opposed to be the stalwart to protect the freedoms and our liberties that come from God. So I wanted to get involved in that for those reasons, just ideological and philosophical reasons, but also, as a relatively new parent. I mean, that does change your perspective a little bit. My wife and I have four children, and then we've had four children in the last 11 years. The oldest is 11 now, and I'm very concerned about the state of the world that they are going to inherit. And even though Texas, in domestic American politics, Texas is rarely talked about it as a battleground state. I actually would argue that Texas is the crown jewel in the left's plan to ultimately conquer and destroy this country from within. And if we ever lose freedom and liberty in Texas, I fear to even think about what that means for freedom and liberty across the country, and then of course what that would mean for the stability of the entire world. And quite frankly, we're seeing some very concerning things that I want to actually hear. You had me on to talk about my perspective, but I also like hearing and learning from people like you who are experiencing things in your side of the planet that, with all due respect, I don't want to see come here. The effects of unchecked mass illegal immigration, for example. And so I'm seeing things around the world, and then also being very concerned that Texas, who I view as the line in the sand for the future of liberty, has not been meeting the challenge anywhere near as adequately as our voters demand and that our citizens deserve.
Well, I think if you look to us, the UK over the pond, it's a warning to you of what can happen whenever you take your eye off the ball and you begin to lose those freedoms and other ideologies. Absolute hatred of God, but also Islam and the whole gender debate and experimenting with children. The list goes on and on of what happens when you don't take those ideals of your nation. But uh, if I could ask you,
Well, can I pull it? Let me highlight that real quick, because just to give some people some color, maybe just one example of what I mean, because people are probably very confused. They know of America, they may probably know of Texas, and they probably think of Texas as this sort of bastion of conservative values and low government. But just to give people just one granular example, you mentioned sort of the transgender issue. And I mean, it's still hard to get your head around the fact that we even have to discuss these things. How many genders are there, or can boys become girls, that sort of thing. Not only was the Texas government not in the battle to push back against radical transgender ideology, when I got elected, I was horrified to learn that the Texas government may well have been one of, if not the biggest funder of the transgender movement in the United States of America. And in fact, Texans were being taxed out of this. I'm not making any of this up. Texans were being taxed out of their homes. We have some of the highest property tax in the country, and their money was being weaponized against them to fund radical transgender adherents to indoctrinate children from K-12 all the way up through our public universities. And it's one of the biggest successes that I've had of late is stopping at least some of that from our public universities. But just about every public university in the state of Texas, funded with tax dollars, was indoctrinating students into radical transgender ideology. And I just bring that up because you mentioned the topic, but I want to give your viewers some color of exactly the types of betrayals I'm talking about, because people would never imagine, I think, that Texas government was one of the biggest funders of the transgender agenda in America, but it's absolutely true.
no, you've just thrown a few grenades in there, so let me pick up a few of those. Um,
Let's do it.
but probably stepping back, I remember I wrote a piece about Texas, about Islam, and we'll get to that in a bit. But in terms of Texas being an absolute conservative Republican bastion of freedom, and then you look back at the history, realize that's not been the case. It's only been maybe in the last 35, 40 years, you've had three Republican governors. I'll let you unpack that. But you kind of have those three, and yet on their watch, you've had all types of issues happen which have chipped away at the freedoms that certainly I in the UK up to maybe 6 months ago thought Texas have in abundance. Texas is solid. It's all good. We can go home and fold our arms. And why do we need a Brian Harrison to do anything? But how has it happened under the watch of Republican governors?
Yeah, no, it's a correct observation. It's a shocking observation, and if these things weren't the case, quite frankly, I'd be very happy to go have a job doing something else. Quite frankly, but there's a need for people to get in there and fight for liberty. So yes, it's a great question because this has not happened under Democrat rule. This is the shocking reality that if I can do nothing else, I want to educate 30 million Texans, hundreds of millions of Americans, and people across the globe because I need everybody engaged in this fight. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, number one, the most simple reason is everybody, when you get in office at any kind of high level, whether you're elected or appointed, you have you're confronted rather quickly with a choice you have to make. You cannot escape the choice, and there's only two options. You can either be popular in the swamp, whatever swamp you're in, and there's not just a swamp in Washington, D.C., every state has a swamp in their state government. You can either be popular in the swamp, or you can stand up and fight for the freedom and liberty of the next generation. You have to make that choice. You can't escape it. And most elected officials of both parties choose to be popular in the swamp. Because when you run for office the first time, maybe you're a good person, maybe you got good ideas, but your peer group is your family, your friends, your neighbors, the farmers, the doctors, the firemen who you grew up with, who you were surrounded with. That was your peer group. Well, the second you get elected, you go down to the Capitol building, and who's your new peer group now? Well, your peer group is other politicians. Your peer group is bureaucrats. It's the special interests. It's the lobbyists. It's the executive branch officials who want the legislature to do their bidding. And so the swamp, this short version is the swamp gets almost everybody. And I'll give you one more data point that's going to, I think, shock you. A friend of mine, a former top Trump White House economist, and I were running some numbers the other day because you mentioned Texas has only relatively recently been an all-Republican state, okay, going back about 3 decades roughly. Okay, it's less than that, but whatever, around that for rough math. The Texas government, and remember, the real test of government, the real measure of government burden isn't taxes, it's spending. Because if government spends $1, it must steal $1 through taxation, right? So if government spends $1, it has to get it from somewhere, and it takes it from you. So government spending, which is the real metric of the growth of government, government spending has grown larger and at a faster rate under Republican governance than it did when Democrats ran the state. And that is a shocking statistic. And I got a caveat, Democrats were definitely different, 30, 40, 50 years ago than the radical, progressive, openly Marxist, socialist Democrats of today. But nonetheless, it really drives home the point that the explosion in the size of government, the explosion in the government spending, the explosion in government tax, the explosion in government spending on radical left-wing priorities like transgenderism, like discriminatory diversity policies in our state agencies and our universities, as well as corporate welfare. Like, people are shocked to learn that Texans, just last year, we passed a bill to steal $1.5 billion from the back pockets of hardworking Texans and ship it off to liberal Hollywood. That's literally true. $1.5 billion was a bill last session, SB 22, take $1.5 billion, give it to liberal Hollywood, and then lo and behold, what are the headlines telling us liberal Hollywood is doing these days? Well, they're funding the presidential campaign of radical Gavin Newsom. So Texans are being taxed out of their homes to fund the presidential campaign of Gavin Newsom. These are literally true statements, as shocking as they are.
I want to go more in the tax, but I want to ask you first, or else we'll lose time. I want to ask you about the issue of Islam and the clash of the Islamization of Texas. And again, I had no idea until I think November, and I started looking. And I was speaking, and then I thought I'm talking about the UK and Islam. I thought I'd better look into US, and I'm sure Texas is all good. And then, oh my word, in terms of mosques, you've got New York, you've got California, and then Texas fighting to overtake them within a couple of years. The Sharia courts with halal food, with all of that. And again, this has happened under the noses of Republican governors. I kind of tell explain that, and it's probably not impossible to explain, but how is Texas now at the point where is Texas going to fall? And I know you were sitting at one of those tables at that Save Texas event, and that was put on back in January. And tell me a little bit about how Texas is at this point.
Well, I mean, at this point, I'm going to be really clear. We're behind the eight ball, and significantly, because to the point we were talking about before, there's been a lot of gaslighting, a lot of misinformation coming out of the establishment in the Texas government. For example, last year, the governor of Texas, Governor Abbott, was when this issue really started to get more of the public's attention. He started putting out public pronouncements, and not just him. I'm not just picking on the governor here, but many elected Republicans in the Texas government started making bold public statements saying, Texas is secure. We don't have to worry about violent extremists within Islam or whatever. Texas has banned Sharia law. This go back and look. Okay, you could do a search for this. I don't know how many elected Republicans in Texas you could find public pronouncements claiming, with no nuance whatsoever, that Texas has banned Sharia law. Here's the problem with that. I'm in the Texas legislature, and I have no clue what they're talking about. I mean, I actually kind of do, but there was no bill that was debated to in any kind of comprehensive way ban Sharia law. Whether you agree with that we think we should do that or shouldn't do that, the facts are the facts, and the Texas government has not banned Sharia law. So what's happened is that a lot of people that have been lulled into a sense of complacency by the dishonest, I'm just going to call it that, it's dishonest, gaslighting coming out of the established leadership in the Texas government. Texas has not banned Sharia law. And we've done a lot of hand waving, a lot of symbolic gestures, a lot of, half-baked legislation. I'll give you one example of that. Actually, let me back up. When they say they ban Sharia law, all they're talking about is one little provision in our family code that sort of give courts direction on how they should or should not deal with foreign law, for example. Okay, well, great. Why is that only in one part of our code, right? So, but let me give you another example. There's an issue that has, I think, made not just national but perhaps international notoriety here called Epic City, just north of me in the Dallas area. And there was a lot of hand waving and people throwing themselves a ticker tape parade last year when we were in session, saying Texas, passed a law to ban Epic City. But what they're not telling you is that in the bill to supposedly ban Epic City, there was an exemption put in the bill to exempt Epic City from the ban on Epic City, which is a Sharia adherent compound proposed that's trying to be built up here in North Texas. So it's that kind of thing where there's a lot of hand waving, there's a lot of rhetoric, but very little on the actual results on the tangible side. And that's the thing that I'm trying to push for is I think Texans deserve action much more than just hollow rhetoric.
And it does seem to be that Texas has been targeted, and I'm not even going to specify what I mean, but simply because some of the figures. So the halal food industry is growing, I think, 22% in Dallas and the same in Houston, in the fastest growing areas. And you think that doesn't just happen by accident. And I'm wondering, is there something I've seen the anti-Sharia caucus that now has 50 members. I think, well, at least now there are people coming together and gathering around this as an issue of concern and talking about it, where 3 months ago, 4 months ago, there wasn't really that consensus. So it does seem to be there are at least some steps being made to galvanize that support. Is that a fair statement? It doesn't go far enough, but
Yeah,
there are
so
some steps.
I hope so. I don't know, and I'm very skeptical actually of this because I have intentionally not joined that caucus because so far I've seen literally no action of any substance come out of that caucus whatsoever. And in fact, the membership of the caucus includes the people who are most responsible for the Islamic resolutions being marched through and forced through passage in the supposedly Republican Texas House of Representatives last session. So I hope that good things come from it. I am cautiously optimistic that if nothing else, what you said, okay, well, maybe it shows that more people are paying attention to the issue. That would be good. But for example, I, many months ago, have called on the Speaker of the Texas House to convene emergency interim oversight hearings and to identify legislative solutions to combat the growing threat from Sharia law. Not one member of the Sharia caucus in the Texas House is even willing to call for interim hearings to deal with Sharia law, at least not that I'm aware of, and the caucus has certainly made no such demands. So I'm out there actually pushing much more aggressively than where the caucus is. Because again, the caucus is made up of members of the House leadership team, which pushed through the Islamic resolutions last session. So I hope something good comes from it, but as of yet, there hasn't been any substance coming out of that caucus yet. But hope springs eternal. Maybe something good will come. But again, and the other point I want to make on that is Texans deserve to have organizations like this to say, hey, we're committed to fighting for this issue, whatever it is, border security, property tax elimination, combating the threat from Sharia. But what we see a lot of times in Texas is these organizations are stood up, whether they're inside the government as a caucus or outside the government as some special interest group. And what they become is over time, they become conservative cover. They become a credential that the officials in the Texas government can point to and say, no, when they fail to deliver real results, they say, no, I'm sorry we didn't get around to whatever it is, eliminating property taxes, securing the border, taking more action on Sharia law, but I tried really hard. Look, I was a member of the Sharia Free Caucus. And so what these things have a tendency to do, I'm not saying that'll be the case in this instance, I hope it's not, but what entities like this have historically been in Texas government is conservative cover for liberals to continue selling out their voters, doing nothing while looking like they're fighting for them. So that's why I have got some cautious and some concern about that group and why I have not joined it. But look, anything to draw more attention to the issue is certainly got some positive aspects to it.
Well, it does, and I get you. It does seem to be that politicians think that a public statement or a speech on the floor actually achieves something. So whenever the announcement about CARE and Muslim Brotherhood, actually we're going to ban them in Texas, and then hey, was it Abbott told Paxton you should strip them of their status. And then I was looking into it, and then I thought, well, surely that's the IRS that does that. And
The IRA,
does
yeah,
anyone
the tax
know
thing,
what's
yeah.
happening? And CARE still, they have what, 3 offices, I think, at least
Well,
in.
yeah, this
What?
is this is more to the point, and I want to, I call balls and strikes. Okay, I care about individual liberty and freedom in the future of Texas, and I'm going to call balls and strikes. I'm critical of the governor when he's growing government, but look, I'm going to praise him when he does something good. He did make a bold designation of the Muslim Brotherhood and CARE as terror organizations. Look, that was a good thing. Okay, but I want some meat on those bones. Okay, what does that mean? Because if it's just a designation, then there's no actions that result from it, then maybe we're not on net even helping the cause. So, for example, if we're saying these organizations are terror organizations, well, what has the state of Texas done to gone after their funding? Because by that designation, this is terror threat finance we're talking about now. Where are the investigations? Where are the indictments? And so that's one thing I think the legislature should do is legislatively codify some of these designations, but also do more to pressure actual investigations, indictments, and potentially arrest if there are terror organizations operating in our state, as it appears that there are. And then one thing to go back to, and not necessarily talk about that new caucus, but something I got to talk about the leadership team in the Texas House, because the leadership of the Texas House, the Speaker of the Texas House, who's the leader, basically has all the powers of a dictator. Whatever the Speaker wants to happen, happens. If he doesn't want it to happen, it's not going to happen, okay? The Speaker of the Texas House was elected not by Republicans. He was elected by Democrats. And that's really shocking, so I'm going to say it again. Even though Republicans have a 26-seat majority right now, the Democrat caucus selected and elected the Speaker of the Texas House. You say, how is that possible? Well, pretty simple. If you take the entire Democrat caucus and they have a choice for Speaker, you only need about 30-something fake Republicans to join in with the Democrat caucus to elect the Democrats' candidate for Speaker. And that is literally what happened a year ago this January. So early January of 2025, the Democrat caucus nominee for Speaker, his name is Dustin Burrows, is who was elected with the help of 30 fake Republicans. So the
Is it a
Democrat
simple
caucus
majority or
Republican Speaker.
2/3?
What's that?
Is it a simple majority or 2/3? How does it work?
Simple majority. So we have 150 members. All you got to do is get to 76 votes. So the Republican caucus had selected their nominee for Speaker, but the Republican caucus's nominee for Speaker was defeated by the Democrat caucus's nominee for Speaker. And so yeah, I know you may need a moment to process that, but once you understand that, you start understanding more about the Texas House. So, for example, the Republican speaker, turns around and he didn't just get those votes for free. He rewarded those Democrats. And so I'm going to give you an example that's going to shock you. 14 members of the Democrat caucus that are supposedly Republican speaker put into House leadership, 14 Democrats in House leadership. By the way, the total number is far bigger, but I'm picking on 14 for a second. These are people he gave powerful co-chairmanship of our powerful committees to 14 Democrats, and 14 Democrats just signed a letter condemning Governor Abbott's designation of CAIR and the Muslim Brotherhood as terror organizations, including the Speaker pro tem of the Texas House of Representatives. And I'm going to say this real slowly. The current sitting Speaker pro tem of the Republican-dominated Texas House of Representatives is a literal Democrat who believes in open borders. He signed a letter condemning Muslim Brotherhood and CAIR's designation as terror organizations. That is currently the case right now. So the House leadership team in a Republican-dominated chamber is literally leading a revolt against the efforts to combat the threat from Sharia law here in Texas.
And you wonder why we're facing an uphill battle. I saw you think might have been yesterday or today actually on Grant Stinchfield talking about this character that I hadn't come across. I know you'd started a petition, I think, Tallarico. I guess that's an example of when people get you into power, you need to grease the palms, and a little bit of money kind of goes, and there's thank yous here and there. Tell us what the situation is.
Yeah, so this is shocking. So a guy named James Tallarico, who I know, served with him in the Texas House now for a few years. He is now the Democrat Party's nominee to be the United States Senator from the state of Texas. And here's the biggest aspect, I think the most scandalous, the most underreported aspect of the James Tallarico rise to national prominence now, and especially as his extremely liberal views are becoming known. I mean, this guy Tallarico, for folks who don't know who he is, how radical he has literally stated that there are, quote, six, I don't know how he gets to the six genders, six genders. He believes that he's very, very passionate, as he puts it, about transgender abortion care. That will hurt your brain if you can think. He believes that after 2,000 years of Christendom, he has determined the real meaning of the biblical narrative of Joseph and Mary, and that's to justify elective abortions. He literally went on Joe Rogan's podcast and said that's the point of the biblical narrative about the Virgin Mary, is that the Bible intended to use us that we could and should support elective abortions. Okay, that is how radical this guy is. And he's now the Democrat nominee for Senate. But the biggest, most underreported aspect of his story, his rise to prominence, is that it wasn't just through the Democrat Party ranks. He was aided and abetted in his ascent to the Democrat nomination by the Republican leadership in the Texas House, because James Tallarico helped elect Dustin Burrows, who is the current supposedly Republican Speaker of the Texas House. That's not a joke. I'm going to say it again. James Tallarico's choice for Speaker of the Texas House was Dustin Burrows. Dustin Burrows is the Speaker, and Dustin Burrows rewarded James Tallarico by giving him 4 committee assignments, which, by the way, is more committee assignments than I am on. That's more committee assignments than many Republicans in the Texas House get. He's on 4 of them, and 2 of them, committees or subcommittees, he was made co-chairman or vice chairman of. So, for example, this guy believes in pushing radical transgender indoctrination, radical and discriminatory DEI policies. He has been pushing legislation to force DEI and transgenderism into our public schools and universities in Texas. Well, guess what? He was made co-chairman of the subcommittee of the Public Education Committee dealing with education, okay, how we educate our workforce. He's made the co-chairman, the vice chairman of all trade, economic, and workforce in the state of Texas. Think about this: trade, economic development. All of that policy in the state of Texas, the world's 8th largest economy, has to run through James Tallarico. And by giving him these vice chairmanships, he gives him more tax dollars. So Texas conservative Republicans are having they're being taxed out of their homes to have their tax money weaponized against them to be handed over to James Tallarico to effectively subsidize James Tallarico's Democrat campaign for the United States Senate. I mean, I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, but it is that problematic. And the voters of Texas have been betrayed in ways that some could argue are beyond even my ability to articulate here. It's a massive, massive betrayal of the patriotic, conservative, hardworking, and overtaxed men and women of the state of Texas.
Part of this is, and I know how you're going to answer, but the Texas has been a magnet, and certainly recently, Texas and Florida, people going there, going away from the failed states of
Yeah.
on the west and east coast, and rushing towards somewhere where they think they can have some freedom to live their lives, and the government will butt out, and they won't be handing over a huge chunks of their paycheck for nothing. Um, and I'm kind of looking into you mentioned about property tax, and to me,
Yeah.
that's a win-win. Why, if you own your own house, should you be paying for the right to live on it? Therefore, you're renting it, you're not owning it.
100%.
And yet, I don't see movement in Texas. Tell me about, because I would think, oh, I'll go to Texas, it'll be free, and then I would get there and I think someone sold me a lie. It doesn't seem to be as free as I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's a myth. I mean, Texas has a reputation, like we talked about at the start, for leading in individual liberty, freedom, low taxes, low regulations. Here's the truth: that's just a myth. And Texas has been just coasting on that reputation, and I'm fighting to make us start living up to it. So yeah, people think Texas is a bastion of freedom. Well, it's true and it's not true. It's true in comparison to many other states. But that's sort of like, I don't want to use an example here, but like, oh, I don't want to be the freest state compared to a bunch of other non-free states. Okay, I want to be the paragon for individual liberty, not just in America, but for the entire world. And Texas is not a low tax state. We have, by one economic group did a study saying that Texas has actually the number one highest effective property tax rate in the entire country. And think about that. And to your point, I think property taxes, especially never-ending property taxes, they're immoral, they're unethical, they're inconsistent with private property rights. They mean you cannot own your home because you can pay off your house, you can pay off your mortgage, call yourself a homeowner. But if you try not, writing a check at the end of the year, and you're going to find out real fast who owns your home. And guess what? It ain't you. You're just a renter, and the government is your landlord. That's immoral. So I'm fighting for the full elimination of property taxes. Okay, so Texas is not a low tax state. Is Texas a low regulatory state? Absolutely not. And in fact, Texas has higher and more occupational licensing regulations. It is literally harder, more burdensome to earn a living in Texas because of the number of jobs that we require government licenses to be able to work, to be able to earn, to legally feed your family. Texas has more occupational regulations than every single other state in the country, including the blue states like New York and California. So it's just a myth that Texas is a low tax state. It's a myth that Texas is a low regulatory state. And it's a myth that the Texas government is small. Just this last session, we passed a budget that exploded state spending. Remember, state spending is the true cost of government. Exploded state spending 42% just from 2 budgets ago. So the Texas government is not small. It's not low tax. It's not low regulation. And it does not prioritize freedom and liberty. And we've gone from a situation where the government in Texas is supposed to be the number one job of government. Remember, protect our freedoms, protect our liberties. The number one threat to that in the state of Texas today is the Texas government. And I'm fighting to change that.
How give us a little bit of kind of behind the scenes of how that's happened. Because I'm thinking, is this the lobbyists? Is this other interests? Is this because those lobbyist interests are in every state, and yet
Yeah.
Texas seems to have fallen down that hole. How has the failing happened in Texas?
Weak Republicans, sellout Republicans, people who lie to their voters, people who hate their voters, people who think their voters are nothing more than a nuisance to be placated every 2 years when it's time to run for the Republican primary. Like I have combated the liberal swamp in Washington, D.C. for many years, most recently with President Trump as his chief of staff, as we mentioned, at a cabinet agency. So like I've seen those battles, but I have never seen anything more disgusting. I've never seen greater, more swampy behavior than my supposedly Republican colleagues in the Texas government, who every 2 years in a Republican primary, they go home and they tell their voters, vote for me, and I will fight against those radical Democrats that want to bankrupt the next generation. Vote for me, I will fight against the leftists who are going to indoctrinate your kids and push transgender indoctrination and explode government and not secure the border. But then the second they get elected, they turn around and literally, not figuratively, they literally vote to put those very same radical Democrats in charge in the Texas government. They control the Texas House of Representatives, as we've discussed now. So that is what happens. People who call themselves Republicans, who say they're conservative, who say they're going to fight for low taxes and low regulations and low spending and secure borders and constitutionally limited government, they're liars, many of them, and they're weak, and they're unable to stand up to these special interests who have massive bank accounts, who can promise them a great life. And there's basically a choice that you're given when you get elected. In fact, I'll give you one anecdote. I was sat down when I first got elected, and the Democrats were chairing, not co-chairs, not vice chairs, were chairing 40% of the committees in the Republican-dominated Texas House. Well, I went on national TV, and I told people about it because I just assumed everybody would be outraged about this. And I was sat down, not by Democrats. I was sat down by Republicans in the Texas House, and I was told, "Hey, Brian, you think you got elected to a legislature, but you didn't. Let me tell you what you really got elected to. You got elected to a fraternity, and you need to start acting like it." And what that means is you can't go picking on the leadership of the Texas House and telling people how much power they're giving to Democrats behind their voters' backs. So the reason is not because these pesky Democrats thwart our efforts. That's the narrative they want to spin. Oh, guys, we would have done these conservative things, but those Democrats, those darn Democrats, guys. There's not enough Democrats in the Texas government, I joke, to pass a birthday resolution if Republicans don't help them. The reason the Texas government has gotten so big, so liberal, is because of weak, fake, liberal establishment Republicans.
Let me finish off with just asking you about you being on the campaign trail. I know, goodness, in America, it's never-ending campaigning, but that's a whole other
Yeah.
question. But the issue of you, and I think someone told me one time I'd been over in the last couple of months, and someone said, "Yeah, Brian Harrison, he's great, but he kind of rubs some of the Republicans up the wrong way." And then I thought, I'm going to look more into Brian and I'm looking through everything you're saying and thinking, yep, 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 yep. There's nothing I would disagree with. And then I see that for the primary, that suddenly you had individuals that were running against you, and I'm thinking, why would you run against this candidate? Certainly, Brian is the candidate you would want as a Republican. Explain that to me.
Yeah, happy to. So yeah, I absolutely do rub people the wrong way in the Texas government. You know who those people are? They're liberals. I don't care what they self-identify as. I don't care if they say they're a Republican. I don't care if they say they're a conservative. I don't care if they say they're a conservative reformer or a conservative fighter. The people who are rubbed the wrong way by me are the people who either want big government or are too scared, too cowardly, and too weak to stand up to the powerful special interests and the establishment in the Texas government. So yes, those people I do rub the wrong way, and I make no apologies for it. And I'll say this: while it's true, I often find myself fighting alone in the Texas government. But you know, when I do that, or with one or two other people, some small number of people, right? Even though I'm often fighting, alone, I do so knowing that I am standing in solidarity with the overwhelming majority of the freedom-loving, patriotic, overtaxed men and women of the state of Texas who want their liberty protected for their kids and their grandkids. And as I go back home to my district, or as I travel around the state, I am just humbled by the shocking amount of overwhelming support, encouragement, people coming up telling me that I've never met, that have been praying for me, and how grateful they are to have somebody in the Texas government who not only listens to them, but fights for them. And I have people all over the state of Texas tell me, "Hey, Brian, even though I can't vote for you, you're not my representative. You are my representative. You are the only voice I've got in the Texas government." So yeah, so because I have taken those bold stands, many of them alone, the liberal establishment didn't appreciate that, and so they found not one but two fake Republicans, liberal sellouts, to run against me, to try and knock me off. And they figured if they got multiple candidates to run against me, maybe their goal was to force me to below 50%, because they knew I was going to win. But if you don't get 50%, no matter, if you got 49% and nobody else is single digits, whatever, you still have to go into a runoff to get over 50%. So their goal was to run multiple candidates against me, throw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars into my district, which absolutely they did, to try and force me into a runoff. And I'm very happy to report that they failed. They got stomped. I beat them soundly and defeated all of their candidates without even having to go to a runoff. The people won in my reelection. The swamp lost, and I'm very proud to be talking to you here today as effectively as the Republican nominee, and who's going to be reelected and go back to the Texas House to continue fighting for liberty as we gavel in next session.
Well, Brian, I'm delighted to have you on. I really do appreciate your time. I'm so glad you swatted away those challengers, those phantom Republicans, and certainly expecting and praying for a fantastic result in November,
Thank you. Yep.
which
Got to defeat
which
the Democrat too. Got to
I
defeat
know,
the
I know
Democrat.
that that is the next step, but that
Yeah,
should be common sense in Texas, but nothing maybe ever is. But thank you for giving us your time,
you bet.
and look forward to seeing you hopefully in Texas over in a week or so.
Yeah, hope to see you in person here soon. Good to talk to you, my friend. Appreciate all you do.
Thank you, Brian.
You bet. Take care.